It is week 9, and just before we start with our low ball or shopping cart, there's a couple things from the last couple classes that came up that I wanted to address. One from the midterm lab, and then one to do with storing API keys on Azure. I hope I didn't delete this project. Maybe I did. Bear with me for just a second. Okay. So in the midterm lab that you guys did last week that was well done, we had the issue with the checkbox field. So in the elections controller, in the elections table, we have a bit field for a majority yes or no. And the issue is when we scaffold out the controller, Visual Studio gives us a text box. So I'm going to show you a bit of a workaround and how I got this working in mine. So I'll show you my fix. I'll show you what it looks like in the browser, and then I'll show you how I did it in code, what I had to change to get it to work. So inside of our election model, we have a Boolean here. Did the winning party get a majority of the seats, yes or no? So some of our records, I go to elections, some of them will show as true and some will show as false. But when we scaffolded out this controller, the issue is on both create and edit, it actually just gave us a text box here. So what I wanted to do is change these to checkboxes both when adding as well as when editing. And if it's true, it should be checked. And if I pick an election where the winner did not get a majority, it should be unchecked. So I'll show you both in the views as well as in the controller how I got this to work. Okay, so in my create, I took out, so I think what we had here originally was exactly like this. It was an input ASP4 majority. So that binds this field automatically to the majority property in our election model. I want to break that. So I took out that original input and I changed it to an input with type equals checkbox. And I took out the ASP4 tag. And you'll notice I actually gave it a different name and ID. I don't want to call this majority because I don't want to bind it directly. The reason why I don't want to bind it directly is HTML checkboxes don't actually have true and false values. They have on or off values. So we're going to have to interpret when the form is submitted whether the value of this field is on or off, and then set the majority property to true or false based on that. So we're going to do that programmatically rather than automatically. Yes, so I'll show you that. So I put in the regular input box, I made it type checkbox, and again, I've given it a different name. I don't want to bind it automatically to the majority property because we get this type mismatch. So then in my controller, and I'll come and I'll show you the edit's a little more complicated because with the edit, we also have to determine when the view loads, should the box be checked or not. So in my create method, in my post method, here's what I did. I've added an extra string property, an extra string parameter to the method definition. So everything that was here that I'm highlighting, this is the scaffolded code. This is what you get when you post the form. You get an election object bound on these fields. So I've added an additional string property. And I've made it a string because the checkbox is going to give us a value of on or off. It can't be Boolean if I want to connect it to my checkbox. So this MAJ, that represents the value of the checkbox, on if it's checked, off if it's unchecked. And then, yes, Giffen, coming back to your question. So then I parsed the value of that string, and then I set the majority, the Boolean, programmatically If the field from the checkbox, if the value is on, I set majority to true. Otherwise, I set it to false. Election is the object that gets bound when the form's posted. So I'm overwriting this property based on the on or off of the checkbox. So then it adds this lowercase election object here and saves. So I can manipulate that object before we save it to the database. Like, let's say, for example, we never got around to doing file uploads, but let's say when the user uploads a file, we want to save that name to the file of the database, but we also want to append some kind of unique identifier on there in case two users upload a file with the same name. We don't want to overwrite another. So we might manipulate that file name before we save it to the database. So this will work for create, and then for edit, in the posting, I did the same. Again, I added in the edit post, added the same string property, and I did the exact same if statement. Check the value of on. If the checkbox is on, the majority is set to true, otherwise the majority is set to false. Now the code in the view is a little more complex because we also have to determine whether the box should appear checked or unchecked. So I'll open up the view and show you the change here. Logic. I created a variable called check and I initialized it to an empty string. And I'm checking if the majority property is true, I set this string to checked. So I've added this little script, lines 7 to 11. And down here, again, I changed my input. I took out the ASP4, and then I write this string here. So if the value is true, we have the checked property being set. If the value is false, we have nothing. We don't need checked equals true and checked equals false with an HTML checkbox. We just have checked or nothing. So that now gives me this result. That in this case, it was a minority government, so the checkbox is unchecked. And if I pick one where the majority is true, it's checked off. So .NET doesn't handle, the scaffolding doesn't handle Boolean values very well. So we'll have to manually kind of override some of the code that it gives us in order that it works properly.
Where does it pull scaffolding? Like, is there a way you could update that so that it would, like, theoretically be better with the checkbox?
That's a good question. It's built right into Visual Studio, so I don't think we have that ability. But this workaround would work for any Boolean field where you want to display the values in a checkbox and let the user toggle that checkbox. Okay, so that was one thing I wanted to review. I'm going to open up my Lowballers project because there's one other thing that I want to do. It was pointed out to me that with our API keys, because we're not storing them within our application, we're storing them in the operating system, basically vault or cache. These values, we don't have them if we publish this to Azure. We only have these values in our local cache. So I'm going to show you how in Azure we can set these up. So I better open up my file where I have my keys. Let's see. Somewhere in here is my Lowballers file that's got my keys. Okay. So we set these in the secret cache. The problem is if I publish my app, my logins are not going to work, even if I've put in. So let's just go through the process of making sure my logins are going to work. in Azure. So I'm going to log into the portal. I've connected my site up to Azure, but it's not running right now. I'm going to may as well start the server. And I guess I better check what database connection I'm using. I may have to change it. Ah, right. We're using a local database. I'm going to need to change that to use an online database. Okay, well, I can do that part on a break. So I'll go into my server and I'll show you where you can store the keys. So where I want to go in my web application is under settings and configuration. It's not loading very quickly for me, is it? I don't know if this is a problem with the internet or this is just a problem with Azure. Other things loading. Okay. I'll try this again. If it takes too long, I'll try to come back to it later in class. I'm not going to wait forever for this to load. Okay, I'll try this again. So to store your keys in Azure, if you go into settings and configuration, we can set up key value pairs here. And in fact, this is actually the recommended place to put your connection string rather than storing it in app settings.json. We actually should create a key called default connection and the value here. Yes, this overrides anything that's in app settings.json. Yep. So in here, if I make a new application setting, and I'll call this authentication : Google : client ID. So the same line we used with setting our user secret. So that'll be my name. And then for the value, I'll take the API, the client ID that we generated in the Google Developer Console. So there's my value. You can ignore this deployment slot setting. We don't need to worry about that right now. That's basically so we could have, for example, one value for production and a separate value for development or staging. So I'll save that. You do need to hit save up here, but I'll create my Google and Facebook. I may as well create all 4 keys. So my authentication : Google : client secret. And I'll put that value in. And then I'll create my Facebook keys in here as well. Now I don't think I've put my live URIs in the developer consoles. So in order to get this to work, I would have to go and do that, which I can do later, but I'll set up all 4 keys. So with Facebook, it's app ID and app secret rather than client ID and client secret. So you can store these things in app settings.json, but this is the recommended place for them to go. So now I've got all 4, and I can just click save on my toolbar. So this, like I said, this won't work until I add the proper redirect URIs in the Facebook developer and Google developer console. Maybe I'll have a chance to do that when we have a break. So this will override, again, anything you put in app settings.json. So if you want to use a local database in app settings.json, but obviously we want the live database, you can just add the default connection as the key name and then put in your live server here. Ah, crap. Oops. So I'll just show you what we're going to do with our site today. So we basically want to work something like this. We want users to be able to go to shop. This is just a working copy. I'll start with my original copy. I did also realize there's one small change we need to make in the database. So we're going to do something like this. We're going to get a list of categories, click on a category, see a list of products in that category, click on a product, pick a quantity, add it to our cart, and then display the user's cart where they can, where we've got a total, they can remove the item for cart, and they can either continue to shop or they can start a checkout process. We should be able to get at least this far, if not farther today. One of the other things we might want to be able to do is display up here how many items are in their cart. We could keep track of that as well. So I am going to go to my database. Let's see, which database am I using here? Okay, I'm using my local. So there is a change we do need to make here. And that change is in the cart table. So if I go in to design mode of my cart table, one thing I didn't think through very carefully was we made the cart ID a varchar. I don't want to do that. I want to change that to be an auto incrementing number. So I'm going to make a couple of changes here. I'm going to click on my data type for cart ID. I'm going to change it to an integer. And then on their identity specification, I want to toggle the isIdentity property from no to yes. And then I want to save my table. We'll then need to make a couple changes in our project to account for this. Because our project, we scaffolded it out, it's expecting this key value to be a string. Now, when you hit save, you may get an error. You may get a message saying you can't save the table. So when I click save, first I'll get a pop-up saying this will affect the products and carts because they're related. Do you want to continue? If you say yes, you may get an error saying you cannot save the table. Wave your hand if anybody gets that error when you go to hit save. No, it's fine. Okay, good. If you get that error, let me know. There's a simple fix to it. So when we want to build today, when we build add to cart, we need to grab the product, we need to know the quantity and the price, as well as who the user is. Now we've got two scenarios with the user. They're either an anonymous person, in which case we don't know who they are, or they've logged into the site and we can identify them. So we'll figure that out a bit later. That might run into next week's class. We'll see. Just make sure you change cart ID to an integer and that identity is set to yes. So now we'll need to make a few changes in our web application code. The first one will be under models and carts. So our cart ID, it says, is a string with a length of 100. So we want to change the data type from string to int, and obviously we can take out the string length if it's not a string. The key attribute is already here. We're going to leave that, but we're just changing the data type. I should have thought of this when I created this store. Thought of it too late. So that's one change. There's one more small change we need to make, and it's here in our low ballers context. So if we open up this file in models, down here in this on model creating event, we've got this block of code here that says the cart ID has a value of generated never. This is because it was originally a string. We're now changing it and we want the database to generate the value. So you can either comment that section or you can delete it. I'll just comment it. We don't need it. It's not, we don't need to worry about the encoding, and we do actually want the value to be generated. And then build. We shouldn't see any changes to the front end of the application, but at least it's set up now that that cart ID will come from SQL Server. KC. Much easier to just click this button on the toolbar. There's comment and uncomment. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a controller, but we're not going to use scaffolding because this is going to have all our custom logic for the shopping cart. So we're going to have to kind of build these methods one at a time, like add to cart, display cart, and remove from cart. So I'm going to right-click controllers. I'm going to add a new controller, but I'm just going to pick empty. because it's not tied to a specific table exactly. Well, I mean, it is tied to the cards table, but we don't want all of the generic create, read, update, delete methods. We're going to write our own. So I'm just going to pick an empty controller, and I will call it shop. That way, all requests here will start with /shop, and then whatever the method is. /shop, add to cart, /shop, remove from cart, etc. So we will not get any views auto-generated. We're going to have to do these ourselves. So it gives us an index view. The other thing that's different, so if we go and look at, let's say, our categories controller, which we scaffolded, when we use scaffolding, the scaffolding automatically puts this right at the top of our controller. What's happening in this section that I've highlighted in blue? What's that code doing? Josh? Right. So it's the second part that's the important part. It's telling our controller to connect and use our database connection class so it can talk to the database. When we scaffold an empty control and when we scaffold the products controller, same thing. Right? So we don't have this in an empty controller, but our controller is going to need the database because we're going to interact with the carts table. So we need an instance of our low ballers context, and then we need a constructor that takes an instance of our class and instantiates our database connection. So we need this in our Now, I'm getting a reference error here. Remember, when we scaffolded the controllers, we have to pick a model. So it automatically references the model namespace, which is where the context lives. This is empty, so there is no reference up here to models. So in order to use our low ballers context, we need to make a reference to the model namespace. And then we've got a constructor that accepts an instance of our DB context. So whenever you instantiate this controller, you have to pass it a database connection. So this way, any of the methods in here automatically have access to talk to the database. So that's step one. We got to put this in here ourselves. So now on our index method, when the user clicks on the shop link and it's going to call the index method, we want to show them a view that displays the categories in the database. Each category will be a link. The user can click on it and then see products in that category. So in here, we're going to return an index view, but we also want to write a query that goes and fetches the list of categories and sends those back to the browser. So we will return the list of categories to the view. So we'll use our context. And we can use an order by here to fetch them in alphabetical order. And we'll convert that query result to a list. Yep. Yeah. It already knows. See, if I mouse over it, it can infer that it's going to be a list of categories. It used to be, and now with Core, they've moved in the opposite, in the direction of implicit typing. If you look at my older GitHub repositories, mark COMP2084, I would have declared it as list of type category, which we can do, but they've moved back in this direction. And then we just pass this list to our view. Now the view, we can scaffold it out, although we're going to want to make some changes to what we get. We can scaffold a page that will display a list of categories, but we're going to want to reformat it a bit. I should say we're going to want to reformat it a lot. So if I right click my method name and choose add view, we'll call it index. I want to pick one of these templates. Which template, which style of view should we use? Create, delete, details, edit, empty, or list? Yeah, we want a list so that we can display that category data that we're passing. So we'll pick list. And what model do I pick? What type of data are we going to display? No, not yet. It's not the cart page. This is the first shopping page. This is displaying a list of categories to the user. Yeah, so we want the categories model. So it's called index, the template is list, and the model is categories. And make sure we use our layout page. Yes, and using the low ballers context. And then we'll put a link to this in our nav bar. So we now have a new shop subfolder with our one page so far. I'm going to go to shared and layout. And in my nav bar, we're going to make a new public link. Anybody can see it. So our controller is going to be the shop controller, and our action will be index. And our link will say shop. So if I refresh my home page, I should have a new link in the navigation bar. When we click it, it should load our new shop index view, which shows a list of categories. So I've added lines 39 to 41 in my layout template. We can see what our page looks like. So I'll start my site. So there should be a new link in my navigation bar, and it should take us to this view we just built. So now I can click on shop. And I want to see a list of categories ordered from A to Z. So here's what we've got. Now this looks much like our admin page for managing categories. This page is supposed to be here for shoppers. So I would suggest it's functional, but there's a whole bunch of stuff we need to do with it. What should we change? What are we going to need to change here? Yep. We definitely will want to remove edit and delete. What else would you change? Yep, we should probably get rid of create as well. Not let the customers be able to create new categories in our store. Anything else you'd change?
Maybe you can make the category names into links to
Yep.
the main product.
Sure, we could reformat these. We could probably change the title, which just says index, which is kind of useless. So we've used the list template, but this is what we get, right? We get an HTML table with create, edit, delete, and details links. So we're going to change a lot of the HTML in this view. So the first thing, we'll maybe change this heading here. So I'm going to get rid of, I'm actually going to get rid of everything above the for each. So from this, everything between the H1 and the for each, we're not even going to use a table. We don't need a grid. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to delete those table tags. I'm actually going to delete all the HTML. All I want is my loop here. We'll add some other formatting instead. So what we want to do is we want to display the categories in blocks in 3 columns. So if we've got, say, 6 categories, we'll have them in 2 rows of 3. So we can use Bootstrap to kind of space them out. So outside of my loop, I'll create maybe a section tag. And then I'll also use the row class. And this is outside of my loop. And now I'll use some Bootstrap wrapping. We can see what this looks like so far. Won't be too fancy. Okay, so this is what we get so far. We just get the names printed across the screen. So let's add some wrapping around this. And we're going to use, Bootstrap has a class called a card. It basically builds like a square around an element. So I'm going to use that class. And we want all the categories to be centered in the middle of their cards. And we want it to be, and we want them to have this be the same height. So now I'll drag this display for in here. Oh, I may need one more div, sorry. We want to use the card body class. So this should create boxes of the same height and width and center the name of our category in the middle. We'll see how this looks. And then we'll also need to make these links, because right now it's just going to display static text, so the user can't do anything. So something like this. we also want to make these clickable. So I'm actually going to change what's here. We're going to take out this and we're going to replace it with a link. Our controller is shop. Our action will be browse. So we're going to make that method next. And then we want to pass in the a parameter called category. So we can pass in the item.name. So each of these should be links, and it'll show the category name and pass the category name as a parameter to the browse method. So we'll try this out and see if I refresh, what does this look like? So it looks something like this. Now I can click on, my links don't go anywhere yet, but that's because they're calling the browse method and we haven't written the browse method. Maybe there's a class with some padding as well. Let's see if we add. Figure it out. See if I put in an M-2, do I get a bit of padding? No. All right, I'll figure that out. Okay, it's 10 to 2, 5 to 2. Let's take a break here. I'll push what we've done so far to GitHub. There, that's better. So in my class here, I added M-3, and that creates some spacing between them. Gives it a margin. Actually, maybe that's too low. Maybe I wanted M1. Okay, I'll push what we did to Git. We'll take a pause here.